Well, thank you all for joining us today for an overview on marketing as part of our kickoff to our Native Market Success webinar series. I'm Brittany Beck, International Market Specialist for the American Indian Foods Program here at the Intertribal Ag Council. Please welcome Mr. Dustin Finkel, who is the CEO and founder of Kapop Snacks and Awakened Foods. Dustin was featured in an episode of Shark Tank with his product Kapop and is also a professor at the University of Colorado. Dustin, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I assume it's afternoon at this point for most people. Real quick before I get started, I do need access to share the screen. So whoever owns the Zoom, if you could let me share the screen, that'd be great. As we get that going, I do want to say thank you for having me. As we mentioned earlier, there's a multitude of different seminars that I've had the opportunity to teach. So tonight we're going to go through the overview of marketing, but there's also some others that you can look at from a direct marketing perspective. We have a webinar. We also have one on innovation. And if there's any questions coming out of any of these things, please let me know. My contact information is at the back. And as you'll see, I try and keep this at the kind of 60,000 foot level because there's a lot to cover. So as you get into the weeds of marketing and strategy and all of the good stuff that is around building a business and a brand and selling your products, please do not hesitate to reach out. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here. Give me a nod, I guess. Can you guys see the screen here? Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome.
Yes.
Well, a little bit more about who I am and why you should somewhat pay attention to what I'm saying, I guess. Started my career in investment banking with Goldman Sachs, switched into consumer packaged goods after getting my MBA at Northwestern in Chicago. I've worked in consumer packaged goods for quite some time, everything from big CPGs like General Mills and Danone down to startups like my own. I actually had the opportunity to be the first ever in launching a national gluten-free product with gluten-free checks and really saw the power of what we are able to do with healthy and nutritious ingredients. As was mentioned, I started a company called Awakened Foods by starting Kapop. Kapop was launched in 2008. I came together with another company, Bubba's Fine Foods, to create Awakened Foods. We also do manufacturing, and we've been named the fastest growing company in Colorado for 2 years running. So it's pretty exciting. And again, as mentioned, you know, my claim to fame, so to speak, my D-level celebrity, maybe like F-level celebrity, is my appearance on Shark Tank. And so if you have a chance to search it on YouTube, you can see me make a fool of myself in front of a national audience, but had the opportunity to present my product on Shark Tank. And if you have any questions about that at the end, always happy to share some behind the scenes facts and things about that show. As you can see, I'm wearing a cape, so you know there's some fun stories behind that. So let's jump into what is marketing. And if at any time anyone wants to raise their hand, I don't know if Brittany or Latasha or anyone can kind of monitor that for me and let me know, but I'm happy to take questions as we go or at the end as well. So what is marketing? Well, essentially marketing is all the activities that we do to communicate the value of a product or service to an audience who wants to buy it. So you're exchanging that offering in exchange for someone paying for it, right? We all know that. But ultimately, if you really think about what marketing is, people have a misconception that it's just advertising or it's just getting promotion out there. There's so much more, which we're going to talk about, because ultimately you have to create the right value for a consumer. You have to understand their risk reward proposition. You have to understand how to communicate that value. And most importantly, as you'll see, you have to know who to communicate that value to. So that whole enterprise, the whole activity is really critical in building that marketing strategy. Now, marketing is also conducted amongst a lot of different audiences. So there's B2B, B2C, C2C. B2B is business to business, business to consumer, and consumer to consumer. We'll talk about each one because what's interesting, especially in the food world, is that we have multiple audiences. If you think about a product going to a grocery store, well, your first consumer or customer is really that grocery store. It may even be a distributor before you get to that grocery store. And so then from that grocery store, you also have to communicate the value to consumers who are buying actually your product at the grocery store. And so there's a lot of ways to think about communicating to the appropriate target, how you do that, et cetera. So business to business, business to consumer, there is such access. And in a different presentation, you can watch about direct marketing, but there's such access to consumers via online channels. Amazon.com is the one that most people know about. Your website is incredibly powerful because you can get a lot more information and get a better relationship with your consumers through your website. There are sites like thrive.com and so many other ways to communicate that value out to your consumer. So business to consumer, and then consumer to consumer, which really is not necessarily something that we'll talk about as much, but that's things like Etsy or eBay or other ways that people communicate. So marketing is about building that value, but that value is really inherent and really important in building brands, right? And so I usually do this interactively. I'll kind of do this with myself a little bit. If we look at the brands up here, you see the top left, I can pretty much guarantee you everyone on this call knows what these brands are, right? We have Starbucks on the top left, Apple, Ferrari, Target, Windows. You don't need any words. This power of the symbols here create that linkage, right? And that power is what drives consumers to your product. Without branding, without creating value, there's really no reason someone should buy your product versus another person's product. And we're going to talk about commodities, and I talk about it again in another presentation. But even commodity level products can create value and create differentiation in a manner that allows consumers to engage in their brand versus somebody else's. And so ultimately, the question is, what is a brand? How do we define a brand? And a brand is the collective emotional experiences that customers have with your product or service. And I'm not going to go through this whole blueprint here, but essentially it's the relationship. And the difference between that relationship and someone that might have it with a private label product, i.e. a retailer brand or something of that nature, is that we create engagement and loyalty with those products. And we do that by having this relationship, having something distinct, really creating differentiation that creates value for the consumer, that creates a relationship with that consumer. And so having that brand relevance is absolutely critical. And we're going to talk about how to do that throughout the rest of this deck. So again, so far, brand, emotional relevance, value. Those are kind of the key topics so far. As you will hear throughout this presentation and every presentation I give, if you come to my class at University of Colorado, or if you hear me in my business, I'm always talking about one thing, and that is who's our target. It's always, always paramount that you focus all your efforts on who your target is. And you might ask, well, how do I figure out who my target is? That's a great question. And again, we're going to dive into that here a little bit, because without your target, without identifying your target, without identifying who you're going to focus your efforts on, you can waste a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of resources behind creating benefits or value that is not parallel or not in sync with who you should be selling to. So the first thing that you want to do is create some type of segmentation. Very much like how it sounds. You want to segment the market into different buckets. Well, there's two primary ways that we do segmentation. There's demographic segmentation and psychographic segmentation. Demographic are things that are kind of black and white and factual, i.e. age, religion, gender, income, education. These things are kind of factual, really set in stone. Did you go to college or did you not? Do you make this income or do you make less or more than that income? These are very statistically relevant, significant ideas about who your consumer is. The advantage is it's really easy to get this information, generally speaking. The disadvantage is everyone has access to this information. So it's hard for you to differentiate who your segment is, who your target is, versus maybe the guy down the road selling the same product. So it's really important to take that next step and understand who your consumer is at a deeper level. And this is what's called psychographics. This is how they feel, what their emotional state is. So if you think about Gatorade as an example, and you think about who Gatorade's target is, you probably think about males or athletes, but you might get into somebody who you might start saying they're competitive. They're fueled by their sport. They're intense. These are psychographic emotions. You start to get a real true picture of who this person is. If you just do demographic, it's male, X age, X income. That can be a lot of people. When you start putting these psychographic elements behind it, you can really get a clear picture of who that person is. And you know you've done a really good job segmenting or targeting your audience when you can describe that person to such a level of detail that you can almost picture one person. It's you know, people sometimes at big CPGs name them, like here's Susie. Susie is X, because it gets so crystal clear on who this is. So we're going to talk about the next process. So as I always talk about in school, sorry for all these things flashing up on my screen. As I always talk about in school, there are absolutely critical things that pop in terms of frameworks. The number one framework is the 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion. So let's talk about each one. You got product. This is what's actually creating the value for the consumer. What are you actually giving them? What's the service? What's the product? What are you offering to them? The next is price. What are you charging? What is the value you're asking your consumer to give up in exchange for that product? And this is really important. It's much more detailed than you might think in terms of coming up with price and value. And again, we're going to talk through that. The next is place. Where do you sell it? Depending on your type of product or service or offering, it's really critical to sell it at a place that the consumer expects it, or at the very least, train them to know where to find your product. Because again, if you have a great product, you have a great price, they don't know where to buy it, that's a problem. And then finally, of course, it's promotion, which is communicating that value. How do you get them to know about your product, right? And as we all know, you have to have awareness of a product first and foremost before you can be interested in buying a product. We go through the consumer decision cycle a lot more in direct marketing in a different webinar. So let's go through each one. So the product is creating value. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the whole purpose of marketing is to create value by an exchange of product or services to meet a consumer's needs, preferably your target or segment's needs. This can be goods, services, ideas. For instance, a PSA, a public service announcement, is an idea. We're still trying to communicate that value and get consumers to adopt a behavior behind an idea. A service can be anything, an accountant is a service. And then goods are obvious. It's the food we sell. It's the brands that we try and sell, etc. The next one is price. This is one where I think people kind of don't think about this in its whole totality. People think about prices. What's the price on the tag? It's a lot more than that. It's everything a buyer is giving up to buy your particular product or service, and then how much they're willing to spend on yours. So if you look at these two airlines, United and Spirit, classically speaking, you would think that United is going to be more expensive than Spirit, and that's mostly true because Spirit is going after a different target consumer, one who values economy travel, one who's okay really trying to make sure they're just getting from place A to B, whereas United is catering to someone who probably wants a little bit more of an elevated experience. Now, in today's travel world, it's not much more of an elevated experience, but as someone who is very loyal to United, only because I've been traveling so much, things like upgrades, choosing your seat, not having to pay for all these extras, that's considered as I think about the price. It's not just value. You think about all the incremental benefits that is coming along with that value. The next is place. Where is it shelved? Well, again, there's a little bit more complexity to this than just the place it's found on the shelf. Traditionally speaking, we think about the place it's sold on the shelf, and that's really critical. But it goes back to the entire supply chain of how it gets to that particular place on the shelf. What are the distributors that you have to use? What is the freight? What is the impact on the value creation? What's the impact on the consumer experience? What's the impact on your product benefit to the consumer based on where it's found? And all of these factors are really critical. And then finally, promotion. I found these fun ads, which I kind of got a kick out of, but how do you communicate the value to your consumer? Now, one thing I will say, and I will harp on this, and I've challenged many persons to try and convince me otherwise. I believe that any business problem, any brand, any issue that you're facing with your business can be solved with the 4 Ps. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it means that they ultimately fall into one of those 4 areas. Your struggles, your growth either fall into a product, price, promotion, or placement problem, or more than one. But ultimately, if you really dissect your business, your brand, your product into those 4 buckets and really dive into the metrics that define each one of those, you can typically find what works. And I can go through some case studies and examples later if we have time. So the second way to start thinking about your overall strategy is the 3 Cs. Like my students, you're going to hear a lot of different frameworks, but the 3 Cs are company, competition, and customer. Okay. And ultimately, you see, again, the most important thing at the center of the hexagon here is your target. The reason this is important is because you have your inner company issues and you have your outer economic issues, your macro environmental issues. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But ultimately, you want to make sure that as you're thinking about the 3 Cs, you're doing so in consideration of what's happening in the world around you. So the best example of late is COVID. Think about how the marketplace changed significantly during COVID. If you were a travel company, what type of impact did that have? How did you have to adjust? As a food-based brand, perfect example, going from retail to really focus on online brick and mortar, going from brick and mortar to brick and click or online sales. The macro environmental world significantly changes, and sometimes you have to change the processes and organization around that. But let's dive into the 3 C's a bit. So you have company. So the company is, what is your defining capability or advantage within your company that makes you different, better than your competition? What is your core essence? What is your core competency? What do you do better? And that's really, really important to understand, because ultimately this is how you will think about driving differentiation in the marketplace. An example I give in a different presentation is around Pepsi and Coke. So Pepsi and Coke saw soda sales declining rapidly as the health and wellness movement, again, macro environmental problems, the health and wellness movement started gaining momentum. And so they looked at themselves, and what did they do well? Well, they distribute beverages really well. They bottle beverages really well. And so they started acquiring companies and innovating water companies, juice companies, coconut waters, ultimately being able to extend into other platforms because they knew they could make it, distribute it, and do that really well. The ultimate company value is a sustainable competitive advantage. And that's one that can be protected for 3 to 5 years. So this is something where the best example is like a patent. If you come up with a patent, you have a sustainable competitive advantage that no one can copy. So in an ideal world, when you're evaluating your competencies, you look to see what are those benefits that you can do. I'm going to pause. Brittany, if you can look at the chats maybe for me and let me know if there's any questions I see a couple popping up, but I'll keep going. The next one is the consumer.
No, that was yep, it's.
What's that? The next one is the consumer. So understanding who your consumer is. I've said this kind of ad nauseum, and I'll continue to say it as promised at the beginning. Who is your target consumers? How do they buy? How they interact with your product? What do they find most valuable? Who do they buy from? Who do they buy from in addition to you? All of these questions are really critical to understand what their needs are. If you're going to think about innovation, which again, a plug for another webinar that we did, you really have to understand these questions to identify how to best innovate. And then finally, who are your competitors, and understanding what they do well. Be realistic. What does your competitor do better than you? What do they do worse than you? What are advantages that you can take? What are risks that you have to foresee? And so answering these 3 questions are critical as you think about your marketing strategy. Now, as a little teaser, you can add the 4th C, which is your collaborators. These are your manufacturers, your distributors, your suppliers, etc. And the reason I bring this up is this is especially good for thinking about how to improve your business innovation. If you really partner with each one of these different areas, it's amazing the ideas and benefits that you can gather. For instance, at Awaken Foods, we have really strong relationships with some of our suppliers. They bring us new clients who are looking for our services. They bring us new ingredients that they know might be beneficial to the type of products that we're manufacturing. These type of interactions are critical as part of what we call here the firm of alliance. Okay, so if you're tracking, you have learned quite a bit so far. And again, I'm squeezing a lot of information into a short amount of time. But you might be asking, okay, how do we learn all this? Well, that jumps into what is commonly known as marketing research. Okay, so we're going to talk about how do you get this information and how do you do it on a low budget, because none of us have the big CPG budgets. And I would argue, even if you did, I would still recommend going this route. When I was running Abbott Nutritious Snacks division at Abbott Laboratories, we had the $1 million research budget, and I still got the best answers from being scrappy and entrepreneurial. This is kind of one of my favorite quotes here from Henry Ford, who, as we all know, created the car. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? And one of the things I love about this is because if you go with research, you have to know when to really think about research and when to kind of understand how to leverage what people say and what they want. And the 2 images here are essentially, on one hand, you have what Henry Ford said. On the other hand, imagine you went to a bunch of 6-year-olds and asked them what they wanted on their birthday cake. you would get something like this. And if you ate something like this, I would not want to be the parent around that child shortly thereafter. So you have to take what consumers say as indicative of directions, but not gospel. They have to inform your decisions. Part of doing research is not being so paralyzed by the numbers and the research that you are unable to move forward because of all the information. And again, we're going to talk about that marketing research process and how to go forward. But I will say everyone kind of falls along the spectrum, the wing it, hey, I'm just going to go with what I think, to the analysis paralysis. I tend to fall on the left side of the chart myself, but everyone should be somewhere in this middle area. So the marketing research process. So first, you have to define the objective in research. So your objective in research might be, I want to identify who my target is. It might be, I want to launch a new product and I need to understand what consumers are looking for, my consumers. It might be, I need to understand how to think about my pricing, or one of the 4 Ps. You really want to be clear on what you're asking. A huge failure in the marketing research process is when we try and get too much information about too many different topics. And it really clouds your ability to get clear, concise information from your consumers, and it disrupts the consumer's ability to answer in a way that's valuable to you. Designing the research, we're going to go through some of the ways you can get the research design here in a minute. Collecting the data, obviously. One of the things, again, another failure is getting the data and not knowing what to do with it. Data is nothing. Data is just numbers and information. Taking that data, processing it, analyze it is how you actually come up with insights. So what that 6 out of 10 people prefer X? What does that really mean? How do we think about that? There's an example in the innovation deck where we go through where you can think about how people measure things. If you measure a cookie versus another cookie, for instance, and they both rate at a 6 out of 10, you might say, well, they taste the same. But that's just numbers. You have to dive into the information. What if one of those cookies had a big grouping of people at 1 and a big grouping of people at 10, and it kind of averaged out to 5 or 6, versus the other one clumped around the number 6? Very different stories to tell between each of those insights I come up with. You want to take an action plan from that, and then you want to go forward. So this is kind of the gold standard, how to execute. So let's talk about each one briefly. So ultimately, what is your question? What are you trying to get at? This is the paramount. Being very crystal clear and spending time up front will reduce time in the back end. What is the question you're trying to answer, and how do you get that information? When I'm working with my team at my company or with students on marketing research, this is constantly the thing that we spend a lot of time on, because ultimately you can spend a lot of effort, and this happens a multitude of times, even at big CPGs, trying to answer a question only to get answers back that have nothing to do with what you're really trying to answer or really trying to ask. And so be very thoughtful about the question and the information you're seeking. If you're not sure yet, it's probably time to go back and do a little bit more secondary research and identify what that means, which is the next slide. So there's primary and secondary research. Primary research is where I'm going to go in reverse order of this slide, but primary research is where you ask directly to consumers questions. It is the primary technology. So for instance, if I were to ask this group of people on this call how they feel about this presentation, how they think I'm doing, what they think about marketing, and I got information, that's primary research because I'm conducting it. I'm asking the questions. It's specifically geared to what I need. Now, the downside to it, as you'll see in a second, is it's costly because I have to design it, I have to execute it, I have to make sure that it works. Whereas secondary research is all the types of information that you can find out there. The power of Google, right? If you search literally any question on Google, you will get an answer. Now, the advantage to that is it saves time. It's relatively cheap because the information is readily available. The disadvantages are that it might not be relevant to what you're particularly looking for. It may not be timely. So a lot of times I'll search on Google and get an article from like 2011, right? And you start questioning, is that still relevant with everything that's happened in the environment? Or the sources might not be that trustworthy, right? So, the great example we always joke about is like Wikipedia. Do you trust where the data is coming from? So you have the advantages and you have the disadvantages. One thing I will say is that using secondary information first to kind of narrow down on what you're trying to learn, get hypotheses. The old scientific method is very, very powerful. Come up with a hypothesis and try and either validate or invalidate that hypothesis through primary research is very, very helpful. On top of when you think about research, there's both qualitative and quantitative research. So qualitative research are things that you can ask questions of, but it's not really hard and factual. It's not statistically relevant necessarily. Focus groups, getting a bunch of people in a room and asking them a bunch of questions, you get a lot of learnings, right? That's a primary research. You get a lot of learnings, but it's not statistically significant because you might have 10, 20 people, and you're just asking questions. Even if you have them rating things, it's still much more qualitative because you're having a conversation, you're learning from them. Observation interviews, you're learning from them. That's all qualitative and very, very important because you can go much more in depth when you have the opportunity to spend time learning about how someone feels about something. Quantitative research is more the hard facts. Sending a survey out to 100 people and getting responses, that's quantitative, and you can take that action. And what I think is really powerful is if you're able to do quantitative and qualitative. So a lot of times as a brand, what we'll do is we'll do a quantitative survey with our heavy users or any of our users. We might do it on Facebook and incentivize our buyers to our consumers to take a survey, and we'll get X% result. And then what we'll do is we'll go back to some of them and we'll say, hey, can we talk to you and understand a little bit more about how you thought about these questions, how you thought about these answers? One scrappy way that we've done it with nearly every successful innovation that we've had is what I call backyard focus groups. We recruit our target to come to a backyard in our neighborhood. I moderate the focus group and we ask questions and we learn. And again, super cheap, very, very valuable. And most of us know by now, I think, how statistical relevance works. In fact, to get a statistical relevance for the entire United States, which is 330 million people, I think you only need 1,000 or a couple thousand people. So you think about when we're thinking about our target markets, 20, 30 people are really, really valuable to helping us understand where we want to go. Now, when you think about the survey, right, we want to make sure that we're getting the questions asked. And so there's unstructured and structured, or commonly known as open-ended or closed-ended questions, right? And so you want to be very thoughtful, again, about what you're asking closed, i.e. ratings, rankings, numbers, versus open or unstructured, because you want to drive high engagement. Incentivize, incentivize, incentivize. You don't have to do a lot. A free product, a discount code. People love to give their information, but you got to make sure you do it in a way that's distinct. And the longer your survey, the more intense your survey, the bigger the incentive needs to be, which is pretty obvious. Okay, so we've done all these surveys, we've done all this research. Now we need to dive into the data and analysis, right? So data is taking that information and converting it into a story that allows you to predict the behavior in the future. It doesn't mean you're going to be right, but it allows you to guide your information. Again, I talked about how to do that in examples. I'm going to do two here, and I think I gave one away here a bit, but we're going to do the example of Christmas trees and Christmas lights. So if you did your research, and let's say you did your quantitative research, and you found that 65% of consumers who buy a tree immediately buy lights in your Home Depot, what could you do? And again, I go right back to the 4 Ps. And again, this is usually an open-ended interaction, but you go right back to the 4 Ps. And I would think, okay, first product, let's just go through the 4 Ps. Well, product, well, there's a bunch of different ways you could think here. Well, number one, why don't you add lights to the trees and create a new product that optimizes those? And you can probably charge more than you would have if you sold them individually, because you're offering an incremental value to consumers. And this, as we all know, has happened. You could think about a lot of different ways around the innovation of product. Now let's jump to place. Well, if you know that they're going to buy them together, there's two strategies you could argue between. One is you can shelve them next to each other. So when people buy a tree, they want to buy light. We'll make it really easy for them to buy that product, make it very close by. Another strategy some retailers might use is actually put it farther away, because they know that if 65% are going to buy them, they now make them walk through some high traffic zones where they might be incentivized to add things to their basket and increase that basket range. So there's two strategies you could argue about there. Promotion, think about advertising. You want to promote these together. Hey, if you buy a tree, we'll give you 10% off lights, so on and so forth. And then finally, price. Again, what type of value offerings can you create between the two things? We talked about one, if you combine the products, you can add a higher price. You can offer incentives to buy the lights. You can disincentivize people depending on how you think about it. So again, that's a perfect example of taking data and converting it into insights. I mentioned it on the cookie example here, both 5.4 tasting Chips Ahoy versus the private label. What does that actually mean? Well, if you think about it, it could mean, and I think my chart here is messed up, but ultimately what this would show, if it worked correctly, is that you had a big clump of people at the 1s and the 10s on one of them, and you had a bunch of people clumped around the 6, the 5.4, and the other. And so again, that's just data. What do you do about that? Well, if I'm the marketer, if I'm the brand owner, I would look at that data, and on the one that's clumped at the 1s and the 10s, I would say, hey, we clearly have a target market issue. The target market at the 10s is who we should be focusing our efforts on, because the people at the 1s do not enjoy our product. And we need to erase them from our efforts and focus on the 10s, and thereby driving that number higher in the future. If I'm Chips Ahoy and I'm clustered around that 5.4, then I would look at this and say, okay, do we need to increase the product value? Do we need to decrease price? What are the results that are creating this perception of a 5.4 when, hey, as Chips Ahoy, we should be at 8 or 9? That's what you do by taking those insights. The next part of research that I find so incredibly critical, and I think so many people forget about because they get lost in the numbers, is you need to also use your brains and real world insights, right? Don't get just so hung up in the numbers. This is a real life example that happened to me when I ran Abbott Nutritious Snacks and I was running bar categories. So we had a lot of sweet bars, and there was a big movement by a bunch of people on the team to say, hey, we should go into savory bars. It's a movement, there's some new brands launching. And in fact, when you did the testing, 85% of the interest in new bars was savory. However, if you looked at the actual purchasing behavior of bars, 18 of the top 20 bar products were chocolate, and then the next 10 were sweet products. And so what that tells me is sometimes, and again, this is why research is sometimes you got to take it with a grain of salt and you got to use real world evidence. Sometimes people have idealistic visions of what they want to do versus what they are. So a great example is if you said to people, how often do you think you should work out? They'll say, 3 to 5 times per week. How often do you work out? And most consumers will say the same, because they, even on a quantitative test, they want to make themselves feel better. And of course, if we observe people, we will realize that's not accurate. And so you need to look at real world data in combination with what consumers say to really think about how to drive your consumer strategy, whether it's innovation, targeting, etc. So I mentioned at the beginning the importance of segmenting, targeting, and positioning. We're going to go a little bit more into that. So now you've done all your research, you have a crystal clear understanding of how you're going to get this research done. How are you going to build that to life with segmenting, targeting, and positioning? So again, here are some examples of the segmentation offerings. We got demographics and psychographics. Demographics encapsulate geographics, and psychographics encapsulates behavioral. But you need to divide your group of consumers into market segmentation. I can tell you there is very few examples of trying to serve everyone and getting away with it. It happens, I'm sure, but ultimately the brands that are most successful, and if you think about the brands that are most successful, have a very clear target of who they're going after. And they don't apologize for that. Think about a Ferrari as an example, as an extreme example, or a Louis Vuitton purse. What ultimately, they are not trying to serve a different audience. If Ferrari all of a sudden came out with a $30,000 car and was cheap, it would diminish what they stood for. And in fact, it would probably take away from the consumers that they currently have. And so they know who their target is and they stay true to that. They don't try and discount against that. So the way you do this is you want to think about all of these different ways and put your people into consumer demographics. And so again, you do a geographic, and it's not one or the other. These all should play into each other. It should be kind of a matrix, right? What geography, what demographic, what psychographic, what are the benefits they're trying to achieve from your particular product? What is the behavior they're engaging with? Think about weddings, right? People segment for people buying wedding. If you go buy flowers and you're buying it for everyday flowers, it's going to cost one thing. If you go buy it for a wedding, it's going to cost probably 2, 3x that thing, because they're segmenting, they understand the occasion, they understand the behavior, and they segment their audience that way. And that's really, really important as we think again about marketing, creating value. So you create this segment. The next you want to kind of think about is you want to evaluate that segment attractiveness, right? So the first is it substantial, right? Is it reachable? Can you get the people to understand what your product is? Can you get to those consumers? Are they responsive? Do they react positively to your offering? Obviously, if they react negatively, you probably have the wrong segment. Is it profitable? This is an example on the left that I love using. It's a very simple, oversimple example, but you might look at homes versus businesses if you're a cleaning service. Let's say you're a cleaning service, and you're trying to decide if you should go after homes or businesses. You say, okay, homes is 75,000 homes. There's only 1,000 businesses. Homes must be the better way to go. But then you kind of go down the route here and you see the adoption of homes is 1%, businesses is 20%. How often are they going to buy your product? How much are they going to pay for it? What's the profit margin? So on and so forth. And you find at the end that the profit is $600,000 in my example for businesses versus homes, even though you have 1/75th of that audience. And so that's, again, you need to measure the profitability through thinking about these types of unit economics. And then are they unique? If you have a bunch of segments that are essentially overlapping, you've tried to pull the wool over your own eyes and still go after everyone with the idea that you're creating a segmentation. Once you have that segmentation, you want to build and understand who your target is. And there's a lot to doing this, and we don't have time to get into all of it, but this is an example of a segmentation graph a target market summary. And if you read this, this is one I did as an example for Gatorade. If you read this and you go all the way through it, active athletes of all ages and performance levels who love to compete, they perceive themselves as winners, when they use it, why they use it, how they feel. At the end of reading this, you feel very confident that you understand who your consumer is and what they're looking for. And it makes it a lot easier to design marketing strategies, design advertising, to design new products, etc. And then you come up with these different reasons why people should support that. Now, a big company like Gatorade, and I don't want to confuse you guys on this, a big company like Gatorade can have multiple targets, right? They can sub-segment, they can create multiple targets because they have the value and the dollars to do so. Most of us do not. Then we finally come to positioning. So positioning, I love this little I forget the inspirational posters that they have, but brand positioning is essentially the inherent structure that supports your company. It is everything your company stands for, right? Who is your target? What's the value you're offering? Everything should fall off the brand positioning. And the way we do brand positioning is what I like to call a white space map. And it's as simple as drawing an X and Y axis. That's the simplest part. The hardest part is then figuring this out. So what you want to do is list your consumers' perceptions in relation to competitors. So on the X and Y axis, you want to define what are the values you're going to put here. Now, people typically go right away to quality and price. And I always argue against that one. So you put quality up here and you put price down here. And what you're looking for is to list all of your other competitors on this map and then figure out where the white space is. And that's where you can differentiate, right? So you identify your competitors' positions, you determine the consumer preferences, and then you select their position, etc. But let me tell you something. If you do quality, and usually it's price is the one I have the biggest problem with, you're always going to have a white space, lower price, higher quality. And the problem with that is that's nearly impossible, right? If lower price and higher quality was a thing, everyone would try and go after it. And so you have to find axes that are not only differentiated, but realistic. And so you might want to say flavor and health benefits could be one, right? You might want to say additives versus natural could be two axes. And the best way to do this, and I do this all the time with my teams, is you just build a lot of these until one is kind of the aha moment. Like, this is the one that really makes sense. There's a clear insight here. There's a clear white space that makes sense. I cannot encourage you enough to use this exercise because it will allow you to differentiate and find where you are differentiated against your competition. At the very beginning of this presentation, I talked about differentiating yourself against your competition, finding your differentiation as a company. This is the way to do that. Once you identify your white space, let's say this is the white space down here, you're going to go after on whatever axis, you select that position, and then you monitor the positioning strategy. Because if it is a true white space, people are going to start coming into that area wanting to take your lunch. And then you have to A, insulate against them through continued marketing research and strategy, continued innovation, continued best marketing practices, and you're going to kind of look for the next white space as you grow your company. So ultimately, your positioning strategy will look like this. To your target, X is the brand of Y that does as X benefit. So for instance, Gatorade's example might be two winners. Gatorade is the brand of nutritional enhancement that gives you the ability to beat your competition, because we were studied by the NCAA and our brand character is Y. So you build this into a very succinct method of taking your target here, I showed you, right? Gatorade is the brand of aspirational replenishment that goes after this target and provides these benefits. So let me get back. So now you have your segmenting, you have your targeting, and you have your positioning. And by the way, we are doing a year's worth of marketing classes in 1 hour. So you should, if you're staying along with me so far, you should be very proud of yourself. We're about 2/3 done. So consumer behavior is the next one. And ultimately, we want to understand at the beginning, I talked about value to the consumer. And so ultimately, the value needs to make sure that the benefit outweighs the cost. It's that simple. Does the benefit of this engagement outweigh the cost of this engagement, whether it's a product, a service, an idea? So as consumers go through that decision process, they always go through the following. They have a need recognition, they go search for information, they look for alternatives, they make their purchase, and then they have a post-purchase decision whether or not they made the right decision. Every time you buy something, you go through this. And I'll use the example of gum at the checkout as a way to kind of validate that example. You didn't have that need before you walked up, but you walk up, you're checking out, you see gum, you have this recognition that I want gum. Your information search is there the brand that I want, right? Or what do they have here? How's the pricing? You buy it, and then you decide whether or not that was a good impulsive decision or not. That process happens every time, whether you're buying a $100,000 car, a $1 million house, or a pack of gum. The difference is how long you go through the process typically. The higher the risk, which is often equated to price in a lot of cases, the longer the process. So as you've gone through all that, now you come back to your brand and you want to spell branding with the G on the floating because that's always fun, but you will come back to your brand and you have these different elements that allow for branding recognition. And so a brand can use so many different ways. You have logos, symbols, characters, jingles. Think about if I said the best part of waking up is everyone knows Folgers in my cup. If you're an athlete and I say, protect this house, you know that it's Under Armour right away. If you see these characters on the top right with the M or the tiger, you know it's Frosted Flakes and M&Ms. Symbols, we did at the very beginning with Starbucks. Now you have Under Armour and McDonald's. Packaging is something that we talk a lot about during the innovation deck, but the power of packaging to differentiate your brand is critical. Then your brand name. One thing I like to hit on here, it's very important to keep your branding consistent. I talk about this again in the direct consumer world and in innovation, but think about your favorite product. Let's say it's Coca-Cola. And every time you went into the store, it had a different color, a different package, a different name, different characters. You need to create consistency to create that beneficial consumer engagement with your product, right? So finally, how are brands managed as we get towards the tail end of this? You have your manufacturer national brands and your private label brands. So manufacturer brands are like Frosted Flakes and things like that. Then you have your private label brands like Market Pantry, which is Target, Archer Farms, Amazon Basics, 365, etc. Now, I believe most of you would know this, but private label brands are typically made by people like us. You guys on the phone, people like us. You want to be very careful about how you think about your private label strategy as you move forward. Where does private label sit in your strategy and how do you want to optimize that? You have your house of brands. Your house of brands strategy, which is, do you manage it as a house of brands or do you manage it as a brand extension? And think about, as you're building your business, how you want to think about extending that. And I notice here that we're getting into some formatting issues as I popped up, so I apologize. I'll fix this before it goes out. But your brand extension, right? How do you extend your brand? We talk a lot about this during innovation. How do we continue to drive outside of our current core competency? Coke started with Coke, right? Then they expanded with line extensions, Coke Zero, Diet Coke, etc. Starbucks started with coffee, then they started experimenting outside of that realm. And you stay close to the core competency, but what it does is it drives awareness with your consumers. That's what's key here. Now, pricing, we talked about, is the total resources a consumer will give up to acquire a specific product or services. Let's talk about how you need to think about the factors influencing pricing. Now, there's obviously a P&L, and I'm not going to go into P&Ls today. I'm happy to take you guys through P&Ls on a different conversation. But ultimately, P&Ls are critical as you think about where your pricing is, because you need to not only meet the consumer where they're willing to pay, but you need to make money, right? You need to be able to pay for all the work that you're doing. And so when you think about the 5 C's of pricing, you want to think about all of these areas as you come into your pricing. What is competition doing? You don't want to be out of line with competition. It's just a reality because consumers perceive the value of your product based on the competition. Your cost, how much did it cost for you to make this product? What's your objective? Are you trying to gain fast market penetration? Do you want to be a market leader? Who are your customers? And then ultimately, what are other people in the channels doing? Again, when we come back, who is your target across the board? So there's a couple different ones. There's profit-oriented, market penetration, consumer, competitor-oriented, and price skimming. So you want to think about all of these as you think about your strategy. Ultimately, the best way is to really think about where you're trying to achieve, what your goals are as a company, and how fast you want to gain market penetration in the environment. And that will dictate which type of pricing you go after. Again, a lot more complexity into pricing than what I'm showing you here, but these are kind of the high-level thoughts. The other thing that really impacts pricing is price elasticity. So for those of you who don't know price elasticity, it's literally the elasticity of your price, i.e., depending on how much your price changes, how much volume will change in purchases. So there are some products that if you go up 100% in your price, it doesn't really change how many consumers are going to buy that product. Think about medicine, right? This has happened. It's horrible. With the EpiPen, this happened. The EpiPen prices went up 2,000%, created all kinds of hysteria, but ultimately the people who needed it couldn't stop buying it. Now, if you're a pack of gum, as we talked about before, and you go up $1, it's going to dramatically change people's purchasing behavior. There's high elasticity. So, or high inelasticity, I should say. So that impacts it. Now, there's 3 different ways we think about elasticity. There's cross-price elasticity. And what that means is what is relevant to your product. So the classic example is printers and ink. If you buy a printer, you need ink. The pricing of each other impacts the purchases of the other. The other one is like milk. When I was running an organic milk company, the pricing of conventional milk impacted how purchasing happened on organic milk, right? If conventional milk pricing went up, people were more apt to try organic milk because the price gap wasn't as big. That's cross-price elasticity. Income effect, this is obvious. The more money your target makes, the higher value they're willing to spend on things, right? So whereas a cup of ramen noodles might be like gold mine to a college student, to a CEO exec at a Fortune 100 company, that's a whole different game. They think in different ways. That's why your target's so critical. And then substitution effect. This is best put by gas stations. What do you often see when you see a gas station? You see another one across the street, right? And there's this substitution effect. So now you're thinking about competing with someone directly across the street. Even Starbucks, right? You see that with coffee shops. You see that with grocery stores. This is a whole different economic conversation. But competitors tend to end up getting closer and closer and closer to each other to capture the biggest overlap target market. Ultimately, it creates a substitution effect that you need to be considerate of. And some fun animations here for no reason. Now, when you think about pricing, ultimately, as a pricer, there's 3 different pricing mechanics that we all do, whether you're in food, clothing, services, etc. There's the EDLP, which is the everyday low price. There's the high lows, and there's hybrid. Everyday low price is, look, this is the lowest price. I'm not going to do discounts. I'm giving you the best price. This is what it is. This is typically seen by, like, for instance, it's a new trend in buying cars where people don't want to haggle. They just want, what's the best price I'm going to get? That's what they do. The high low is kind of the traditional way of most retail environments, which is I'm going to be at X price for most of this year, and every couple of months or whatever time period, I'm going to have a discount. High, low. And you're incentivizing people to act based on that behavior. I would say the most prevalent pricing strategy in the marketplace is hybrid, where you do a little bit of both. You try and price your product at the best value you can for every day, but you do every once in a while discount that for different economic reasons, We talk about this again in direct marketing, how to think about pricing, how to price your product, and how to discount. So check out that webinar as well. And with that, we finally come to the end. Hopefully you have learned something about this. And in this deck, on the last page here in the appendix, there's some secondary research sites you can check out. But I'm more than happy to take any questions or answer anything that people might have. And I hope you gained a little bit of knowledge. Again, I started at the 60,000 foot level. Each one of these slides could be its own hour, but I hope you got something out of it. So thank you guys very much.